Kaiser Planning Commission meeting for Wednesday, June 14th. Has everybody had a chance to review the minutes of April 12th, 2017, which in my mind is like a year ago? Do I have it here, a motion?
I move the minutes of April 12 be approved.
Do I hear a second?
Second.
All in favor of approving the minutes as written of April 12th, 2017, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Josh wasn't
there.
there.
Yeah.
Moving on, this is the period of time that is made available for those who wish to speak about an issue that is not currently on tonight's agenda. I'm looking out, I don't see anybody. Debbie, is anybody signed up? So we will pass on that one and move to the public hearing, text amendment section 2.303, off-street parking and loading. And I'll go ahead and open that. Staff.
All right, thank you. So tonight we are looking at section 2.303, which is our off-street parking and loading section. Some of you may remember that this was modified not so long ago. Unfortunately, what we found is that in one of those pieces of modifications, there was a little bit of a snafu that was created with some ambiguity, and that there was ultimately two categories for theaters. And this was actually brought on our radar by our legal department as kind of one of those pieces that we needed to do some housekeeping and clean up. So we decided to bring that to you guys tonight, along with some other pieces that were added on as kind of a bonus. We reached out to our environmental folks and our code compliance officer to see if we could maybe wordsmith a little bit of language in here to make our lives and our jobs a little easier. But the primary substance of this text amendment really revolves around the parking chart. And if you guys want to, I don't know how much you've had a chance to look at it, but if you want to just go through, I thought there's pretty minimal changes. We can walk through them fairly quickly just so you understand them, and then I'll entertain questions. The first changes noted are on page 2, and those are really very wordsmithing clarifications. In F, it was suggested by the stormwater folks, and the attorney kind of massaged it a little bit just to make sure they had adequate language to deal with stormwater things. In subsection A under 303.04, we added just the no more than, because there was some arguments of, well, what if somebody wanted to tandem 4 cars or 5 cars or 6 cars? And at some point it becomes impractical. So we felt that 2 is appropriate and was what the intent was. On the following page, we talked a little bit about using the word driveway in a couple of those specific sections. That's in there for our code compliance officer. Primarily, we've had some issues where folks want to just turn their front grass into a parking lot area. And we didn't really have a tool in our code or in the parking ordinance that would prevent that from being able to happen. So in just adding a few little words, it gives us a little bit of a hook to keep it confined to a driveway area that is designed and intended for parking. And G was added specifically for our environmental folks. When you get to page 4, there's just all this red. Basically, we got rid of the entire chart and we reformatted the chart. We've had a lot of questions over the years, and most recently with the latest rendition and change of parking, we changed some things with multifamily requirements and some different standards. So we have a lot of developers that will call and ask questions, and they go, well, we're confused by your chart. We don't understand what this means, and so we have to walk them through it like every time. So what we did is we looked at it, I highlighted the key elimination, which is that theater for movie or play. We got rid of that at a 1 to 3 seats because there was another category that was already at 1 to 4 seats. We feel is more appropriate at that lessened parking requirement. And then at the very tail end of the chart, we had all these multiple categories for manufacturing and warehousing based on building sizes. And the development code already gives flexibility for a study to be done or alternate parking requirements to be proposed if they provide adequate documentation as to why the standard could be changed. And at basically the director's approval, an alternate parking standard can be changed. So we felt it was just really redundant to have all those categories. And so we cleaned that up and combined it just to one category for industrial and manufacturing and processing, and one category for warehousing, storage. And so below that, all the new chart, basically on the next couple pages, is what we created. And we reformatted, instead of the 3 columns, it's just 2 columns. We felt it was a lot easier to read, but the substance is only represented in those like 3 highlighted categories. So, and then again, scrolling through the rest of it, there was a couple items, just wordsmithing. As we were going through the code, one of the things we always try to do when we amend code sections is we like to look at what other cities are doing. We like to look at the state model code and see what they suggest. And one discrepancy that I found was we had no standard for a parallel parking space. So our parking space size is a certain size for a head-in space, but for a parallel space, there was no delineation. So literally, you would not be able to fit a car next to another car. So we kind of looked at what other cities use and the state uses for a standard parallel parking space. And there's a lot of different options. Some folks have a space and they require a dead area. We're proposing that we just clarify that head-in spaces are 9 by 18 and that parallel spaces are 9 by 22. So you have a little more room to maneuver to get in and out of that space. Good question.
Yeah, so when you say parallel parking,
Mhm.
are you saying lots that are parallel to each other, or just like what you saw parallel parking in the city?
I mean, classically what you would see parallel parking in like the downtown core, so you're not pulling into a space, but you're literally parking along a curb line. Rarely do you see it built, but there have been times where private developers have come in and say, hey, parking lot, I have only this much width, so I can fit a row of head-in, and I could put some parallel spaces on this side. And so that's what we're talking about.
So the term parallel would be the car is parallel to the aisle direction. So
Thank you. Yes. And then the other piece we modified there on that same page was with aisle width specifically. It was just to clarify that when you have a 2-way aisle width, you need to provide enough width for 2 cars to pass. Basically, angled parking, if you're going one-way direction, you can have a lot skinnier aisle because it takes less room to maneuver the car. And that has been something that we've interpreted as such for many years. But we had a recent project that came up, and a developer had put together a site plan, and building permits were applied for, and there was a problem with the parking lot layout, and there was not enough room. And so this kind of was aimed to clarify that for folks. Let's see, we added a little bit of language about shielding lighting in parking lots, so we're not throwing bright lights onto folks. And then under the landscaping section, you see a lot of red, but it's really not that different than it was before. What we did is, as I said, we kind of worked with our environmental division, and they have some goals, generally speaking, to increase vegetation and cover and reduce impervious surfaces, things like that. So we added some language that basically was kind of goal-driven to say, hey, let's incorporate the stormwater quality facilities whenever possible. And then we moved some language around about the planting spaces for trees, requiring 1 tree per 8 spaces just as a flat out requirement, and then have a minimum requirement for 4 square feet of a landscaped area for each tree well. We eliminated the language about curbing because there's other methods that can be used that might be better. So we gave some flexibility in design there. And then we added a proximity factor, basically that requires trees to be within a certain distance of the asphalt or the concrete area. Reason for that is for, well, from a stormwater perspective, you have a lot of asphalt or impervious surface and you get a lot of heat, and it kind of, the heat islanding kind of effect. And so if you have trees in proximity to that area, it helps with shade. So we're saying, hey, 1/3 of the mature tree canopy needs to overlap that, which will keep trees closer to that paved surface. So that's 2-inch caliper. That lives elsewhere in the code, but we've had issues sometimes with developers connecting the dots, and so they'll come in with a parking plan with these little tiny trees, and we're like, no. So we added it there. It's a little bit of a layer of redundancy, but we felt it was just more user-friendly. That's pretty much the changes we're proposing tonight. There wasn't a ton of substance to it, but I really do think that the changes that we're making are going to make the code a lot more usable. I think it's going to make it a lot more clear, and frankly, it's going to be a better product in the end result. So with that, if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Go ahead, Michael.
So in regards to the parallel parking that I was asking about, if I could find my comment, is there any reason why we have to have a length rather than just having an obvious parallel parking area? You know, you have the width, but the length allows for, you know, if you had two smaller cars can fit maybe in the 22-foot length.
So typically, and I'm sure this will be familiar with your own experience, the reason we want those dimensions is so that we can demarcate them. Because if you don't demarcate them, then it turns into very inefficient parking, and somebody parks, you know, half a car length away from the next one, and nobody wants to get that tight, and nobody wants to. So we require that they're actually delineated on the ground, so that we're making more efficient use of that impervious surface. So that's the reason we have a dimension, rather than just allowing a free-for-all length.
Right. And the 22-foot, was that some type of standard you saw?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different standards that actually different cities use. The model code, well, some cities had just a straight 9 by 24 foot length, and that was their standard. I think that showed up in 2 of the different cities we looked at. A few of the others showed at the 9 by 22 foot standard, and included requirements that if you had 2 spaces, you could do 2 spaces next to each other, and then you'd have to have a 4-foot brick of dead space, and then you could have 2 more spaces for maneuverability, so 2 cars could come in next to each other, but then they'd have room to move out. And then some were a shorter space, but a larger brick of dead space, like one was 8 feet, and having more of a standardized space, the 9 by 18 with an 8-foot space for every 2 spaces. And so the 9 by 22, frankly, is a little bit small based on the other cities' standards. But as Nate and I discussed it, because originally I had 9 by 24 in there because it was just an easy way to measure it. And we both kind of looked and said, that seems long compared to how common are these parallel spaces going to be. So we kind of fell back to that 9 by 22, which we felt was a very defensible standard. And it was interesting looking at different parking lot layouts because frankly there was as many different versions. Every single city had a little different take on how they laid it out, but space sizes were pretty consistent. Some were a little bigger. A lot of cities had a 20-foot wide space or 20-foot long space. Ours is 18 and has been forever. So yeah, so that's why we landed on the 9 by 22. We felt it was the easiest to apply, and it might be a little tight, especially if a bunch of big trucks are coming in trying to park. They're going to have a hard time, but frankly, in all the years I've worked here, there's been very few times that parallel spaces are proposed because generally they're less efficient. You know, the only reason why I really felt it was appropriate to put it in there, 1, we were opening the parking standards, and 2, as you all well know, we're in this era of redevelopment happening in Kaiser because we've been out of land for a while. We don't have a lot of room to grow, and so giving people some options, especially on narrower lots, which is what we end up having in some of the commercial core. We have some constrained sites that could be redeveloped possibly, and I think giving them some options for different parking layouts than our standard head-in parking that's eating up, 38 plus a 20-foot aisle width, it's a good move. It gives us some flexibility. So
So allow then for, if we're trying for flexibility, the location of these parallel parking spots, or would that have to be 1 site dependent, and 2, would it have to be more of a perimeter thing?
No, they could be located. I mean, they could design them. We did not restrict it purposefully. I think just practically, I know your 90-degree trade parking is going to take up the least amount of land. But if you have a skinny long piece, trade parking might not work. So, I mean, it really would be up to each individual property owner to design it to what they wanted to do. Just previously, we didn't speak about parallel parking at all.
And typically, a parallel stall is the stall of last resort. People, they're not desirable. People don't know how to park in parallel stalls. People only use it when they need it simply as a last resort for an option. So, and that's why we thought being a little tighter, people are just going to have to deal with it, kind of thing.
Any other questions? Jim?
Okay, I've got 4 or 5 quickie ones. I hope they're quick anyway. On page 3, toward the bottom is the red G, a new subsection G, and it talks about all vehicles are subject to the regulations prohibiting illicit discharge. I guess that must be a term of art in the stormwater world or something.
It is.
Okay. No further explanation needed. Going on to page 6, toward the bottom where the new table of parking space requirements is, for the all other multifamily types,
Yes.
this is all other multifamily types. Where is the multifamily?
It should just say multifamily types, Jim. Thank you.
Okay,
That honestly, we didn't change. We just changed the format. We didn't change the title on that one, but that's a good catch, and that is definitely does not need to say all other. So we can
Great.
strike out those 2 words.
Should say just multiple.
Yeah,
family.
it should just say multifamily types
Okay.
because above it is single family and duplex. So I mean,
yeah. So the next one is page 7 at the very top. In the right-hand column, it's combination of heaviest uses. And I guess if you're comfortable as staff with the word heaviest, which is subjective, then I'm okay with it. It might be the same word that's in the code right now, but
yeah, I mean, it was not a change. I mean, on that chart, it was just a reformatting. So I didn't really look at it, to be honest. But I'm open to suggestions.
How about if we said something like most intense? That's the
yeah, that was the only other term that I thought might fit, but I'll leave it up to you guys. If you're
Maybe highest
comfortable with
intensity.
heaviest or would prefer intense, then you can let us know and we can include it in our motion.
I personally like intense usage versus heaviest. Well, the club they may be pretty heavy guys,
So number 4 then is on page 8, and it's at the bottom, and this does not have any proposed changes to it, but rather than just reading the proposed changes, I actually kind of read through the rest of the stuff that was not to be changed. So the C, parking increase, and it talks about the number of minimum required, and the amount is necessary to serve the needs of those who will use the parking facility and is accepted by the community development director. So I was thinking, if there's a site development review, and I guess, is that a hearings officer decision?
No,
It's
it would just be
city
part
staff?
of it'd be staff.
Okay, good then, because I was thinking if site development review or any land use application that addresses parking would have someone saying, hey, I've got some information here, instead of providing the parking that's required, we think we can provide less and it would suit us. And if that lesser amount was approved by the community development director, but the actual land use decision was made by somebody else, then, I don't know.
Yeah, no, this is staff decision.
Okay, great.
And we use that flexibility occasionally, because, the best effort to make this chart applicable, there's all different varieties. And so we frequently will employ that. If they have specific documentation for their specific application, then we have that opportunity and we exercise it sometimes.
Yeah, well, it's good because there's no point in having parking sitting out there that isn't needed or used and then
Exactly.
creates more impervious surface. So my last one is, my fifth one is on page 11, and it's the table about the parking angle and the aisle width. And the two-way, 24 feet, so that's 12 feet for each drive aisle. And I'm thinking, and I'm not sure what typical street standards are, but I was kind of thinking, gee, some street standards, they require a travel lane 12 feet wide, and those are cars going, 25, 30, or whatever miles an hour. If this is a parking lot where people are going slower, is 24 the right number, or maybe 22? So it's just kind of if we can go a little lower, that might, just make less impervious surface and allow a little better flexibility to fit things onto a site.
Certainly 24 is, that's street standard, the standard lane width is 12 feet, but we do vary that, and lane widths can go down to 11 feet. So, that might be an area where you want to say, if we want to tighten things up and try to encourage less impervious surface, even though it would create a little more less of ease in zipping through the parking lot kind of thing, I would think that would be 22 feet would be supportable.
And then on the left, the middle column, where it requires a one-way 24-foot wide for parking that's a 71 to 90 degree angle, given that some of these pickups now are 20 feet long themselves, to back out of a 90 degree parking, it might be reasonable for 24, but again, if 22 is
Right.
workable, then maybe we could go with 22 there also.
Yeah, I would say that for sake of application of the code, I don't really have a dog in the fight one way or the other. I chose the 24-foot standard because that has been the standard in Kaiser for a very long time. It was fairly consistent in other jurisdictions. Some went a little bit skinnier, but they went bigger spaces. So it was kind of that catch-22. In one of the jurisdictions specifically I looked at, everything on theirs was 20-foot space lengths, 24-foot aisle widths for two-way traffic, regardless of what they were doing, and 12 for one-way. And others had a whole giant matrix of options. So we went with the 24, but yeah, I think if you guys were going to look at 22, I would personally, I would encourage you to probably keep it at 22, just to make it consistent. If you were going to keep the 24 for the 90 degree, and I think the idea behind that is you have a car that's 90'd and you got a car on either side. So you've got to get that car out a certain distance before you can maneuver. So you need that room to get the car out and maneuver, because you can't start your turn early, where angled parking, your car's already pointed in kind of the right direction. I will say this is, it's a tough one because the planning world is not always, how do I say this politically correct? The planning world is not always in line with the engineering world, or with the emergency service responder world. And so the skinnier you get with two-way aisles, and when there's cars parked on either side, that would be my biggest concern. I don't know what the fire district say, or the public works department, or the city engineer would say about reducing those aisle widths.
I think
But-
the fire department's going to want the widest thing.
Thank you, Hirsch, for saying that, and I didn't have to. Yes.
Yes, I think that's, we've been around them enough to know that that's the point of view. And
Well, there
being
you-
involved in risk management, as I was, the fire people and the emergency responders are always wider.
Right.
Michael?
Well, to that I'd say, if you could give them a runway, they'd take it, but
I know.
we have to design our city, or the equipment around the city, not the other way. But I did see some other cities that the lower the angle, so the 0 to 40, were even tighter than 22. So
Well, and were those with two-way opposite traffic? Okay,
Yeah, I mean-
because some of them were like if you're one-way traffic, again, your one-way traffic still is going to be skinny. So if you have angled parking going to one way, we're saying that's 14 feet. So it gives you enough room to get out, maneuver, and still drive. But you only have essentially 3 extra feet from what a drive aisle width is. So yeah.
And remember too that most of the parking, even except for the holidays and big shopping days, there's parking there so people can go through too. They don't always have to back up. So I think we should be aware that not everyone's going to be backing out. So
Not very often in our design standards, just because we're requiring trees every 4 spaces and sidewalk connections and things like that. But and bumper stops if there's landscaped areas. But yeah,
but there are those
Sure.
opportunities. So I would say if we could do actually 20 at the lower round and then up to 24 at the 90. So
for where would you want to put the 20?
the 0 to 40
For the two-way traffic?
for two-way traffic. Like I saw some that did have that. I didn't notice that they had wider spots, but
Wider parking widths?
right. I don't remember seeing that. I remember just seeing on their tables it looked just like this. They were showing the one-way, two-way,
And again, sorry. So Shane did quite a comparison, actually Shane and Dina both. The problem is that there's so many variables. As you mentioned, just the width of the stall itself is one of the variables. The depth of the stall is another. And so literally it was across the board as far as the different combinations of those different kinds of things. So I'm a little reluctant to say without changing some of our other variables that just reduce it down dramatically. I start getting a little nervous about it. Because it literally is even I drive a Prius and, it has very good turning radius, but even it has, there are certain bottom lines that you got to be able to maneuver without endangering property, so.
but I think at that lower angle, I mean, you're at a sharper angle coming out rather than.
Yeah, but even a parallel stall,
Yeah, I mean, I think 20 feet is going to be your minimum fire code standard. I mean, it's kind of funny because we actually allow people to go down to 12, and the fire code wouldn't necessarily support that, even in a one-way in all scenarios. But just so I'm just trying to I want to make sure I'm understanding it right. So you're saying for the 0 to 40 degree angle would be the one you'd want to drop to 20, and then the other ones you'd want to see drop to 22,
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I could see this 71 to
including
90
staying at the 24. Okay,
that clearly you are
right.
limited turn until
Yeah.
you are achieved enough.
Sure. I mean, clearly, if you look right above those standards, when we don't have any parking, if it's just an aisle to get into a parking lot, but say you have landscaping on both sides, we require 22 feet for two-way traffic to pass. Frankly, a lot of times we see them built to 24 because industry standards and convenience for customers, but that's our minimum is that 22. So I mean, again, I guess that's up for you guys to decide how you'd want to do that. I would definitely urge you don't drop it too crazy low. I mean, and ultimately it would be one of those things that if, again, I didn't really vet that portion of the chart through the fire district, but that is something that I would probably want, if you do choose to make a motion to change that language, that is something I'll probably want to reach out to them and say, hey, just so you know, this is how, they just hired a new deputy fire marshal here just real recently. And so we've just started to work with them. And the last thing I want to do is burn bridges with them right off the bat. I mean, they are the fire district, so they can put them out. But, so yeah. But so, I mean, I think that would be, come on, that was pretty good.
That was good.
So yeah, but Michael, I clearly, I see where you're going with that the much tighter angle clearly would require less maneuverability than the 90. So,
The only thing I would also throw out for your deliberation is truly on that parallel stall, we hardly ever see that implemented. And that's what you're talking about. Because again, it's the last resort. And generally it's in combination with other angled parking, if it is used. I'm thinking, was it used in the Starbucks? Did we employ that at all?
no, that was all
No,
hidden.
yeah.
It was well, that was the problem, is that you had the apartment complex down the way down south,
and
and it
the
was
adjacent-
angled, but it wasn't as angled as it needed to be.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Anyway, so I'm just saying, I understand the concept. I understand we're trying to eliminate impervious surface where not needed. In my mind, it's a balance of, is it? Yeah, so, I mean, that's fine.
yeah, I mean, I think as long as we're only talking about that very lowest category, I would have a much bigger pause if we were talking about the 90 degree and the 20, then I would be like, no, let's go maneuver some cars and I'll show you that it can't fit. But I think if it's just that 0 to 40, if it's just that 0 to 40, that we drop down to 20 feet for the two-way, I don't have a problem with that. I mean, whatever you guys want to do is good with me. I'm just making my notes to make sure I get the chart changed correctly.
Yeah, I was gonna mention truck. I'm just thinking about over across from Bimart, the parking lot for Goodwill. That parking lot is so tight, I cannot get my truck in there. So I have to, luckily there is some angled. I have to park in the angled, whether I'm going to the other end of the parking lot or not, because if somebody parks too tight to me, I can't get out in the straight-in parking. It's so tight. So I just drive over and park in the angled parking, no matter where I'm going. I park in the same place. And if I have a trailer on,
Right.
I can't park anywhere. I have to park in Bimart's parking lot. So
And it is hard. I mean, the Goodwill project there's a couple of dynamics there. It's not just parking lot dimensions, it's also the amount of use that's there. Frankly, it doesn't have enough parking. It was built at a time where the standards were different, one, but two, it was a big redevelopment project. And so over the years, there's more restaurants there than there used to be when it was originally built. And there's some heavier, higher turnover users there. Actually, I was there at lunch today. And yes, you're right, it's tight. But that is an example of a parking lot that was built down just right to the bare minimums of what they could
that's what I
fit
was
in
gonna
there.
ask. Does it meet current?
I believe that it does. I mean, it was long enough ago. I remember going out and counting parking spaces back when I was the code enforcement guy, when we were doing building permits on that project. But I believe there's a handful of 22-foot aisle widths in there, Kyle, or maybe even some 20s instead of the 24, which is the standard for the two-way aisles with double stacked parking. So I do think that a couple of those aisle widths are smaller, and I can't remember, were you here then, or was that before you? Did they do a variance for some of those aisle widths?
I don't think so.
Okay. I remember we looked at that. I literally remember being out in the field with a tape measure and counting parking spaces, like whatever, 15, almost 20 years ago. So, but I don't think that it is out of compliance as far as our minimum standards for space size, or for most of those aisle widths.
Yeah, and for most people, it's fine. It's just, for me, it is, my truck's a little bit longer than most. And I just want to make sure I'm keeping in perspective what that is. If that one's a little bit small in some places, then that's probably where I have the most problems. So I just want to make sure we don't get into too tight.
Sure.
And us having a problem down the road
Well,
for people.
And I think that, I think again, if you guys aren't looking at reducing the 71 to 90 degree and leaving it at that 24 feet to give a little more flexibility, that is primarily what we've seen built with newer developments in the past several years. It's primarily what you see up in Kaiser Station, which most of the parking lots up there function okay. I think Lowe's builds a little bigger standard because their customers drive a little bigger vehicle.
Right.
But like the Target parking lot, I'm fairly sure most of those aisles were built at 24s, weren't they, Nate?
Target's pretty wide.
Yeah.
I don't have.
And I think some of the bigger aisles they space out, but I think the other interior ones. I mean, so I think that 24, you're probably not going to feel too crunched. It's when you get down into those skinnier
Right, and
sizes that
that's-
it's going to start to get tight.
That's what I wanted to make sure that we were
Mhm.
not, or come up with some kind of matrix that says you can have a bunch of small spots, but you need to have some larger spots in the lot.
Yeah, and I was just thinking that, you know, you go like the boat ramp, they got boat ramp park, or boat parking.
Yep.
And then they got regular parking.
Yep.
That's something that maybe,
I mean, it's definitely something that we could look at. I chose. I mean, it's hard. You know, we have some provision right now in our code for an allowance of compact spaces based on a percent. If you have more than 5 spaces, then a certain percentage of your spaces can be compact. Frankly, what I've found to be true in the years of just applying and reviewing permits, generally the users who are building the buildings, they know their customers a little better than we do. And so they're going to build what's appropriate to their customers, because otherwise it's going to hurt them from a business model. Like for example, we have a provision in our code right now that requires off-street parking and loading spaces for larger businesses. So, you know, we require that. We don't require that for smaller businesses. If we did require that for smaller businesses, we wouldn't have an issue with the Starbucks deliveries in River Road or in the alley behind it like we've had. But the flip side is we wouldn't have been able to seen the project realized or redeveloped because you would have eaten up a huge amount of space for a delivery vehicle. So it is that balance. So I mean, personally, I wouldn't recommend that we get too involved in the matrix of must require X amount of big spaces for every little space, because I think it's just, frankly, trying to overregulate it. But yes.
Go ahead, Jim.
Well, and this is these are minimums, so
Mhm.
if a company does know their customers and they know that all over the country, they've had problems, with people backing out and that kind of stuff and fender benders in the parking lot, they're gonna say, whatever the Kaiser standard is what it is, but we know we need something a foot wider or 2 feet wider, and that's what they'll do. And with these being minimums, the minimum is met, and they'll put in something bigger if they need it.
So Jim, with that thought in mind, you're okay with reducing the minimums?
Well, when I first saw the 24 feet, I thought, okay, it's always worth a question, can it be a little smaller? And so it sounds like maybe it could be 22, but for bigger pickups, and I've got a large high-ceiling van that's as long, I'm sure, as a long pickup, and it's not easily parked in a parking lot. So I'm fine with the 24 feet, or if it were to be 22, I'm fine with that. But then I'm kind of thinking too, we've talked a little bit about maybe that 0 to 40 degree angle. The two-way driveway could be 20 feet. But then, okay, for the 71 to 90, the kind of direct head-in parking, might be best to keep that at 24. And so then I'm looking at it and we got 20, 24, or 20, 22, and 24. So the CAD person that's designing a parking lot, or an engineer, or whoever it is, some planner, well, how many standards are there? Okay, so one aisle's 20, one aisle's 22, one aisle's 24. I'd just as soon have all of those on the right-hand column the same number, just for simplicity's sake.
You also have restriping issues. You know, if you have a whole bunch of modified lanes or modified parking spaces, who's going to enforce that after changes? I know
Yeah.
somebody's going to be out there with a tape measure and checking it.
He's high-tech, it's laser light.
Well,
So I'm fine with the way it is, but I thought it was worth a question to see if something else would be workable.
Well, want to say my little 2 cents. Last month, and I think Michael went to this, there were, at the City of Salem, at the 50 Center, they had Dan Burton come in. He's an expert in livability and an ex-engineer, and he met with the Salem City planning and engineering staff, walked around Salem, and then did a presentation in the evening. And he somewhat inspired me in thinking about cutting back, maybe not huge, but just a little here, a little bit there. It does wonders. You already are doing some things that he already talked about your trees. The more trees, the better. And I'm thinking 22, straight across, 22. Yes, just a little bit cutting back, because asphalt is not livability space. Parking and livability are two different animals. So if we have a little less, as a minimum, as Jim really explained, and you, Shane, that a business knows their customers, and if they're going to have big trucks, and by the way, I have an Element and a huge F-150, F-250 extended cab. So I know what you're talking about, and we pull a horse trailer. So I know what you're talking about looking for space. But I'm like Jim, if we have one this way and one that way, it's just going to be confusing. But thinking of what I heard about Dan Burton, made me cut back just a little bit. That's a step.
And again, it's a minimum. They want to make it 24 or 26 or whatever.
But from a city standpoint, we're saying, okay, we can go a little less if you want to, because we're thinking livability. Just a little less asphalt. So that's my 2
Yeah.
cents.
And just a comment, if it's like a hardware store or Lowe's or something where there's probably going to be a bunch of guys in their big trucks,
Or gals.
that's one
Or
thing.
gals in big trucks
But
too.
if it's-
My wife drives the big truck.
Well, yeah, or if it's going to be some other kind of a use where it's somehow, maybe a stereotype isn't the right way to put it, but if it's a type of use where you hardly ever see any big vehicles, no big 70s boulevard barges, no big modern trucks, it's all kind of smaller vehicles, shorter wheelbases and things, then that company can go down to, if it's 22, they can go down to that minimum, and they don't have to do a bigger one like a Lowe's might do.
the only other thing I was going to throw out for you, I wouldn't necessarily be too concerned about, the table is not incredibly complex. And so I wouldn't worry about having different categories per se. The suggestion of 0 to 40 down to 20, the next two at 22, and the 71 to 90, the 90 degree at 24, it's certainly doable. It's not incredibly complex. And if you're sophisticated enough to use AutoCAD, you should be sophisticated enough to read a table. I just say it. So I wouldn't worry about that too much, is all I'm saying.
Yeah, and then I'm thinking too, when the building permit plans come in and the parking lot is there on the site plan, and okay, you're measuring or looking for a dimension, and okay, all of a sudden you're looking for 3 different dimensions. And the degrees, that's another little thing. Well, all of a sudden you're looking at all these little detailed things, and it's like, enough of this. Let's just try to have some standardization, and that way you won't have to be thinking about 3 or 4 different two-way widths and 4 different degrees. And
Michael?
I think I saw this when I was looking this stuff up about safety and cars moving in and out. Is it, I thought it said that, sorry. I thought it said that your angled parking is you're obviously forcing cars to go in a certain way. We don't always do that, but
Right.
the arrows tell us to. So do we consider that when someone comes in with a parking layout, you tell them, well, to have a safer flow of cars in there, maybe put it at an angle of 70 or 50,
Oh.
you know what I mean?
Honestly, the site is what dictates that. It's the dimensions that they're trying to maximize the effectiveness of the use of the site. And that's really what dictates. Hopefully, the standards that we create are safe for whatever configuration it is. So, again, it's the site that really, they've only got so much dimension and they've got to fit so many parkings, and therefore, how do they do that? And it's pretty sophisticated. Actually, we're pretty sophisticated in saying, okay, this is the best way to do this. Shane's a good boat ramp designer.
Well, I was gonna say I am not an engineer. I did happen to draw up the boat ramp though years ago, and it was kind of interesting because from an aesthetics, the group that was involved with designing the boat ramp and the layout, they liked the angle parking, the way it looked, the way it felt. We looked at a bunch of different boat ramps. The engineer from the state laid it down in just a big square tray because we had a blank slate there. There was no restrictions anywhere. You're gonna have to grade anyway, and we ended up designing it the way it got designed based on that input. So there's some head-in stuff, but everything else is all angled. And generally what we see in parking lot layouts, and it's weird, but a lot of grocery stores do angled parking, but a lot of times that angled parking is actually opposite, right? It's going the opposite direction. So you've got kind of competing movements. But they tend to do the angled parking, and I don't know why that is. It's a little easier to get in and out of, so I suspect it's that. But clearly, the angled parking takes up less width across it, but way more length, because just the way the layout is. So I mean, I think Nate is right in that really the standards that we're looking at, and just for the record, I'm all for one standard fits all. That's the way, totally the easiest thing for me to regulate. I mean, clearly, if we say, hey, it's 12 and 24 or whatever it is across the board, we can get rid of the whole chart and just have one sentence. I'm okay with that too. But again, I tried to kind of keep us in the vein and the structure of the code that we've been using for a long time. I think it's a good code. I think it's, I don't think it's broken, but I think tweaks are always a good idea. The one thing I will say is I would just ask that when you guys get ready to make a motion, make sure we know what it is that we're landing on that you guys want to push forward. Whether or not that's dropping everything down Hirsch to a 22-foot for two-way.
Right.
And I mean, because ultimately that would be, man, if we dropped everything to a 12-foot for one-way and 22-foot for two-way, you could almost just eliminate number 2 in the chart altogether and wordsmith number 1, and you'd be done. Again, my concern would be that 90-degree, and my personal experience, I have a Jeep Wrangler, I have an Audi, and we have a Honda Pilot, because I have a billion children. But my Jeep Wrangler can get in and out of any spot. Great turning radius. It's short, it's like 15 feet long or something. My wife's Pilot has a great turning radius too, but it's, a smaller-ish SUV. It's not a giant SUV, but in small parking lots, it's a little tight. So that's my 2 cents. Just make sure that when we make a motion, I just know what to write down.
Anything from this side? Jerry, Josh, Michael?
Over on the landscaping,
Yes.
and you kind of said this before, but I'm not sure if it's really in the code. So between the spaces of cars that are face to face, is there anything for swales or water collection?
So there's not a outright, I actually talked to the stormwater folks quite a bit about this. So there's nothing outright that straight up requires it for every parking lot. I added the number 1 is new language that basically says incorporation of approved stormwater quality facilities is encouraged. The Stormwater Division is in the midst of getting some design standards adopted. And I actually have a draft copy of some of those standards because I don't want to put anything into our code that's going to be conflicting with what they're trying to accomplish. And I talked a bit with them when we were looking at this. Actually, I talked with them way back in January. This has been a kind of a draft back burner because we knew there was some issues that needed to be tweaked in it. So when I talked with them, I asked them that actually specifically, and they were like, well, we'd rather not require it every place because we don't necessarily want them in every place. So depending on the site, the topography, the overall stormwater management and storm drainage plan, it may make a lot more sense for them to have a stormwater quality feature that's isolated in one spot. They actually kind of tend to prefer those for maintenance and functionality, whereas the landscaping we want for more aesthetics. And if we can dual purpose them, we're all for it. So we don't want to be like a stumbling block to the dual purpose, but they didn't necessarily want that required everywhere. There's kind of some issues right now that we're working through of the effectiveness of trees in some of those stormwater facilities and tree types that work. And the fact that when you get the pollutants that discharge into these storm facilities, the life of the tree, it's almost like you have to replant trees every 5 or 6 years, which then trees aren't getting that mature canopy, so you're not getting the overall cover and the whatever the aspirations and of hey, yay, good trees, lots of clean air. That's not being accomplished as well. So that's why it's not an outright requirement.
Specifically because, again, this is landscaping, not stormwater.
Right.
And so there is some landscaping areas that maybe at the top of the bank or at the, and so to say that it would be required in all landscaping areas would be inappropriate. We do require, they have their own standards and stormwater always has to be addressed. But this is the landscaping section, and so that's the reason why they're saying.
I think it's good that you have at least that encouragement statement right up front.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, where are we right now? Any more questions? I think from what I hear, really the only issue is on page 11, the widths. Personally, I like just a standard 22 all the way through. But
Yeah, I like standardization, and 22 would fit with my thought, given that it's a minimum. And so if some kind of a company thinks 22 is not enough and they prefer 23 or 4 or whatever, then they can do something bigger than 22.
degrees though with 12 feet, even if it is one way.
One of the problems with that is you'll have people that will, just to get everything they can, will do the minimum no matter what it is for their customer, because they don't know. Kind of what I would assume happened at the space we were talking about at there on at Goodwill. Things change with different businesses in that complex, and nobody probably thought ahead at what that could do to people that might be driving larger trucks in that facility. And when the new tenants move in, most of those people have no clue what they need for their customer. They just know they like that spot and they want to be there. So I'm a little bit concerned about just making everything tight, because it could be too tight.
For what it's worth, I think it was a combination of Michael and Jim originally going with that 0 to 40 at 20 feet and basically the 41 to 70 at 22 feet and the 71 to 90 at 24 feet. I mean, I think that you're not, if you're worried, I would not be worried about that kind of a proposal, Kyle. I think
would be
that's
okay with
clearly
that, yeah.
no problem. And I think, ultimately the question then is if you're willing to drop down that 90 degree to 22 feet, the question in everyone's mind is, well, really, how much difference does 2 feet make? And
that's 2 feet of asphalt.
Mhm.
That's what it boils down to.
Yep.
And I personally am under the belief. We have to be reasonable, but every little bit does really count in the bigger picture of livability. But, like Kyle said, I park my truck when I go to Birdie's across the street at Bimart, or I take up 2 aisles. So,
Two spaces.
2 spaces, because you just can't get out. So, I realize that area, that was the Piggly Wiggly store in Kaiser. And things have been rebuilt and added on there, and the parking spots have remained pretty much the same area. So the concerns that have been voiced, I agree, and I would concur with what Shane is suggesting if everybody else does, as far as, because it is saving that little bit of asphalt here and there, but also protecting us guys with the bigger, and gals with the bigger trucks too. Because even though I'm a cyclist, I know trucks are needed. I can get 10 in the back of mine. Michael?
Cap? An upper cap? I mean,
A maximum?
yeah, obviously no developer in their right mind is gonna do 100.
Oh, for width, you mean? No, what would drive that would be, we do have caps, or not caps, we have percentage requirements for overall lot coverage for versus impervious building versus landscaping. So, I mean, ultimately, you're gonna have a push point where you can't just asphalt everything. You've got to have minimum landscape parking and minimum percentage of the overall site parking, minimum setbacks, all of that kind of stuff. So that's really what drives it, though. And we do have the requirement that you can't increase your parking requirements by over 50% without special approval. So you can't just go out and overbuild parking because you want to. So.
Well, everybody kind of agree with that compromise?
Yeah, for sure. You have to close it.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure before I closed it. Okay.
And as Shannon would say, it would be good to note that there is no one in the audience.
There was no
for
one in the audience to do any testifying on this particular hearing issue. Noted. Thank you very much. Well, do I hear a motion?
I will try. I'm trying to think back of what do we have any other changes?
I've got a change on page 6
Okay,
and page 7.
those were just wording.
Right,
Okay.
getting rid of the all other in the title of multifamily and striking heaviest and replacing it with most intense.
Okay.
And then I still don't know what you guys are doing with the chart, but
Okay, so with those wording changes, and then with the chart, I would propose that we go ahead and do the 20, I'm trying to think back, the 20 feet at 0 to 40, and 22 feet on the next two, from 41 to 55, and 56 to 70, and then from 71 to 90, keep that at 24.
I second.
There's a motion that's been made and seconded. Does everybody understand? Any discussion?
The one thing I would say is, and maybe the horse is less stable on this one, but just merge 41 to 70? Make it a simpler table?
yeah, we could do that. What would you want to do with the one-way? It's a 15 or an 18 for the lessened angle. Split the middle and go 16? Okay. I'm fine with that.
Yes.
So merge those two categories.
Yeah, that's
Make the
fine.
one-way 16, the two-way 22.
Is that a friendly amendment?
Yeah, sounds like one.
Yeah.
You agree?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah,
Yeah.
nope, I agree.
Okay.
Yeah, the second agrees with the friendly amendment.
With that, and we've had the discussion, all in favor of the motion with the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? There are none. Any abstentions? None. Does that help?
I think I've got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before we move on to the next area, my little 2 cents here. It had nothing to do with the, under the bicycle parking, you happen to have a picture on here. Can we put a picture of a bike rack more like we have in the front instead of the curly-cued ones? Because standards within the engineering cycle are saying those are a no. And in the regular, what we have out here in front are even cheaper than the curly-cues. It just, when a developer is coming through, sees that, oh, that's what the city wants us to have.
Make the wave.
Yeah.
That's what everybody wants.
Just my 2 cents there. Take a
We'll
picture-
figure that out.
Take a picture out here.
Well, the problem
Those are
is,
beautiful.
I know, and I know you're in love with those, and we are too. The only thing is, it's the artwork that I've got to figure out. All of those drawings were done. We'll figure it out.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on, new and old business, staff report.
You can talk about TGM. First, let me talk to you a little bit about Area B master plan. Area B in the Kaiser Station is where the transit center is and where the letter of intent has been signed for the theaters. So it is moving forward. We are considering all factors involved with amending the master plan. We actually don't have an amendment procedure in the code. And so, as you know, a new master plan will come to Planning Commission first and then go to council. Your recommendation would then go to council. On this one, however, the changes to that master plan are more figurative than they are any change to the site plan or to the policies, to the buffering requirements, the landscaping requirements, all of those things, the transportation mitigations, all of those things are remaining the same. So in considering all of that, we have gone to the city council and asked them to hear this matter directly without coming through the planning commission. We didn't feel it would be a good use of anybody's time to do that, simply because, let me give you an example. One of the conditions, for example, required that all of the site improvements had to be completed before there could be occupancy. Part of the problem is we have sold part of that Area B to a doctors consortium, and we don't have control over it. And so we can't dictate to them or to us how those improvements are made on their property versus ours. So we need to tweak that language to more accurately reflect the current conditions of the property ownership. So with all of that in mind, council has directed that come back to them. We are planning to go back to the city council on July 17th for that master plan amendment hearing. So I didn't want you left out. Certainly, we have the opportunity to participate in that process. But at the same token, given everything else that's in play, we also didn't want to gum up the works by simply saying, well, just for principle's sake, we need to go to the planning commission. So that's Area B. The story on the story poles out here in front of City Hall is
The trees.
the trees. the trees.
Tall tree stumps.
We have chosen to start calling them the tree remnants. Because they're not exactly stumps, and they're certainly not trees anymore. So anyway, the Art Commission is now proceeding with applying for a grant from the Oregon Community Foundation in order to acquire the funding to hire an artist. There's going to be a public outreach process, and so there'll be a community engagement aspect of the project where the intent is to create story poles that are exemplary of the history and culture of our city. At one point, there was discussion about incorporating tribal aspects to it, but at this point, the Art Commission is focusing on local culture and history. So the grant application is due, I think, by the end of July, with an announcement a couple of months after that. I'm not exactly sure of the announcement date, but it's a good project, and everybody's very hopeful about securing that funding. So, but there they stand in the meantime.
Does anyone?
No, you're talking TGM.
So the other update, oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say, has anyone kept checking the condition of those things to make sure they'll still be okay to?
So actually, they have been sprayed. They've been preserved. So they've been protected, and
Fossilized.
well, I wouldn't go that far. But yes, that is a factor. Yeah.
The other thing we wanted to kind of give you guys a quick update on, I know for months it seems we've been talking to you about these exciting TGM grants for the revitalization area plans and the education and outreach grant that's going to give us a costs of growth workshop when considering the whole UGB discussion. We find that the wheels of ODOT and the Federal Highway Administration move much slower than we're used to. So we're still waiting on some things. We did have a phone call today regarding the education and outreach grant, the cost of growth workshop. It looks like with the contracting requirements, there's been a consultant selected, but with the contracting requirements and the things that have to be done before we can actually have that workshop, we're looking like November would be the earliest possible for that workshop. So that was a little, right, but more likely after the first of the year. So we were a little disappointed in that. We literally just got that news today at what, 4:30 or something, or 4:45? Now the other grant, however, which we expect you all to be pretty involved in, the revitalization area plans grant, that's moving right along by those ODOT standards. We actually have a conference call on Friday regarding some contract negotiation things. The consultant has been selected. I don't know if we were able to tell you that before at the last meeting because it was still kind of hush-hush. But our consultant has been selected, and so now they're in the process of negotiating. ODOT and the consultant negotiate. Oh yeah, OTAC is the consultant that was selected. So we're excited to work with them. They had some good projects that they've done. I think they have a good team. So Angelo Planning Group, and Kittleson is doing transportation planning stuff. And I can't remember, there's one other.
Oh, the outreach. Oh, dear.
Oh, no, they might have just been part of the OTAC
Yeah.
umbrella.
they're part of
That's
the
right,
OTAC.
okay. Sorry. So anyway, so that is moving along. We're hoping, I'll just say we're hoping sooner than later we'll be able to have some sort of a kickoff meeting. So stay tuned on that. We do expect that Planning Commission would be involved a lot in that project. You know, I mean, I think many of the things that, Michael, you've talked about as far as intensifying some of those commercial uses, that's really what this project is aimed to look at. So we think hopefully there'll be some opportunities we can realize with that. And then the only other update that I had, you know, last time, and it is funny because Hersha did feel like it was a million years ago that we were talking about Safeway and forever.
Yeah.
But at that last meeting we did have, we'd kind of asked for some guidance for the next few text amendments. I'm sorry, I realize parking wasn't on your list of priorities. It's just one that came up and was timely. Signs was one that we wanted to bring because of some known issues with enforcement and enforceability. We recently were at some seminars and got a bunch more information. Our sign code is pretty good, actually. It's pretty fair, but there was a pretty big Supreme Court decision 2 years ago that we knew about and we'd looked at and we'd talked about, should we make some changes to the sign code? And ultimately, through legal counsel and just workload and time frame, we decided not to crack that open. I was hoping to bring that to you in July, but because of that heavier legal look that needs to be done, Shannon had asked that I'd push that out. So that won't be coming to you in July, and instead we're planning on bringing you the landscaping section in July, which is another section that we've been waiting for stormwater, and as they're moving forward slowly, I'm fairly confident we can get some good changes to that to hopefully improve some of our landscaping standards as a whole. So that's what we'd be looking to hopefully bring to you guys in July.
If you get a chance, especially with landscaping, go to Dan Burden's website. And just good reading. I thought his talk and what the staff from the city of Salem were saying, what they had learned was pretty good stuff and worth it. One other city related and related to landscape, as you probably are aware that the Traffic, Bikeways, and Safety Committee has been trying, and Pedestrian Safety Committee has been trying to raise funds to install a bike repair station. We've handed out flyers almost everywhere. It was, we even got them stuffed in the Monster Cookie registration packets, and a couple of the members were at the Monster Cookie handing them out. About every meeting that I'm at, and I was on the transit board and was handing them out. Well, while at the transit board, I handed out to all the budget committee members, and after the meeting, I was approached by Trip Choice, which used to be the ride share, and I was told, well, we have money in our account for that kind of community encouragement, but it has to be done by June 31st. 30th. You know, or the 30th, yeah. And I said, whoa, can you pay for the whole thing? And the answer was yes. Oh my goodness, we're excited. So we went through working with Bill and Mike Griffin, and Bill was a little concerned. Is this a grant? What is it? Shannon, bless his heart, said, no, it's a gift. And with that, we moved ahead. It's on order. It should be here in 2 weeks. We'll work on installing it within
Post-haste.
this summer. Bill went out and we had a choice of colors. He felt that the color bronze would look nice, and it's going to be installed near the bike rack area because there's lighting, everything.
Just right out here.
Right out here. Wow. So now the committee is, once that gets installed, that'll help us to talk with the neighborhood associations and see if they would like one in their area, and we can do the necessary fundraising. But that was a blessing that just came out of the blue, just because we kept handing those flyers out and got to the right person.
One other thing, sorry.
Yeah.
Then I'll shut up, I promise. You may wonder where Safeway is, the text amendment for the Safeway that you met on. They I'm not sure exactly what's going on internal to their organization. They asked us to hold off going to council so that they could get direction and a decision from their corporate as to how to respond to our recommendation. We basically said, we'll put it off until the July 17th meeting at council, but no longer. And so it's going to the council on July 17th.
With that, council liaison.
Sounds like it, yeah.
So, as you know, we've had a busy couple of months, but really just busy on a couple of topics. And, you know, we had a big work session with the parks, in May, where I guess it was proposed, that we bring back, the staff bring back a resolution, to add $4, to the water bill for parks. That will get a public hearing. That is not set in gold. So, that's gonna happen. I'm not sure when that's gonna come back to us. Because then what we did was, we didn't want that to come back to us until we did the police funding. And so, we moved that process up from August to you saw last
Right.
Monday. And again, it was proposed that that public safety was a priority as proven by a full house in here. So again, it was proposed that we add $4 to the water bill. But again, this is gonna get a public hearing. And so we wanna hear from everybody on these two proposals before the council decides on that matter. So that's kind of what we've been up to. We've just been doing a little bit of resolutions here and there, and haven't really had a lot go through because you guys haven't had meetings, so we haven't had any of that going on. But yeah, so it's been slow other than those two big items. Those were two big ticket items. And then we were just wondering where the Safeway was, and you just answered my question on that. Then I have another question on the hotel.
Okay, I heard about that one. It's the
Because I've been
contractor.
asked, so.
Well, and I'm sure everybody wants to know. The hotel, I've had a conversation with the owner of the hotel. As you know, the permit was taken out and minimal work, there was a footing and foundation that was poured, but it kind of sat there. Well, for whatever reason, I have no idea, I'm not party to that information, but the owner has changed contractors, and we have been in conversation with the replacement contractor. He's picking up the pieces and is proceeding in earnest in July. So from our understanding is we should see a lot of activity beginning in July.
Jerry, you're on for the 19th. You okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Looking around. Everybody's nodding agreeably for adjournment. See you guys in July.